I'm Esho. I'm one of the co-founders of Climate. I'm currently the CEO. So I'm joined by some really awesome panelists, and so I'll give each of you like a few minutes to just introduce yourselves and what you work on. So Greg, why don't you lead it off?
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Gregory Landaway. I'm one of the co-founders of Regen Network and CEO at R&D Public Benefit Corporation. And we're really working to redefine how ecological asset generation takes place. And data is really central to that story. I think our driving question is, how do we recenter land stewards and real ecological results as the primary drivers backed by good science, and kind of sidestep a lot of the bureaucracy that is currently challenging how we build markets around this. And again, data is really a core part of that story. So I'm excited about the panel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Shim. I lead IBM's sustainability software business. So really interesting dichotomy, I think, coming from the corporate lens. Data is core to everything we do. When we work with all of our customers, mostly enterprise customers, it's the biggest challenge that they have in terms of the data management and sourcing and reporting and all the things that are required to actually accelerate your sustainability journey, right? You need to know where your baseline is and where you are, and then you need to understand what is the delta between that and my goals that I've articulated and stated publicly, and how do I gather the right insights to get me along that journey. And so I have about 10 products in my portfolio. They range from everything from like ESG data management and reporting to more operational products that maybe support like commercial real estate and energy efficiency within buildings, or traceability within your supply chain, and of course like the scope 1, 2, and 3 calculations and all of that. So all of the operational pieces, that's where a lot of the data is coming from, and then trying to tag that or integrate that in with a single system of record that allows you to get a holistic sense of where your business is and then where it needs to go. That is the biggest challenge that we help our customers with our products. And I'll end on this. It's, we work with, as I mentioned, mostly enterprise companies. They're everything from like the Fortune 1050 to much smaller. And unfortunately, even the Fortune 1050 companies will admit Chatham House rules or in one-on-one settings, not in settings that are this public, but they'll say, we're still using spreadsheets to try to figure out where we are, where we're going. And we're talking about the largest companies in the world. So when we think about data and how we need to make sense of it and how we need to make sure we're sourcing it and utilizing it appropriately, we are not. So if we're talking about all the things that we're talking about today and this week during Climate Week, trying to accomplish the goals that we need to faster and with more sustainable decision making, then, and no pun intended there, then we need to make sure we're leveraging technology as part of that, and that's what we're trying to help focus on. So stop there.
That's an amazing intro. Mark Johnson, Environmental Solutions Architect for Protocol Labs. I work on our environmental initiative called Filecoin Green. Filecoin is the world's largest decentralized storage network, and Filecoin Green is tasked with making that network verifiably sustainable. Filecoin network, there are about 3,500 storage providers across this network, distributed globally, which is about it's 3,500 small modular data centers. And our collective storage capacity is equivalent to about 90,000 copies of all of Wikipedia. It's about 10% of Google. And with all of those data centers, there's a significant amount of electricity that is consumed and therefore environmental impact that is generated. And so we try to monitor and mitigate all of that.
Hi, Simone Shaheen. I'm at MSCI. MSCI is a large ESG and climate data provider. We have an index franchise, risk, and analytical tools. We have a real estate business. We work across the ecosystem, so asset owners, hedge funds, asset managers. I focus my time mostly with the banks and some large asset managers in helping make sense of climate and ESG.
Awesome. Thank you for those. Thank you for those interests. So, I want to open it up by asking Greg, how do you work with decentralized infrastructure and decentralized data infrastructure, and what are the sort of problems that you have to tackle when building with it?
Yeah, great question. So, I think core to what Regen Network is building, and I think that this largely probably applies across the decentralized data story for many of us in the climate, biodiversity, and ecological health market space, is this idea of an attestation graph or network in which you can allow different counterparties to be anchoring and signing different pieces of data so that over time you're creating a better and better record of who is saying what about where, using what methodology, who has peer reviewed it and verified it. And you really want to be able to do all of that in a privacy preserving way in which the right things can be made public, such as the right people have audited and peer reviewed, but the right things can remain private. There's a number of different reasons why you need to have that. Generally speaking, in the blockchain space, we refer to that as zero knowledge, a zero knowledge system. And the last attribute you need is semantic data, where you can really get rich metadata tags and create a relational database between the information. I'd say the biggest challenge, right, is interoperating with the disparate ways that people collect data, from spreadsheets to, and in our case, we're really working to empower the world of land steward, to recenter this on the ground to the real action that's being taken. So we're more on the, if there was a debit side and a credit side, or a supply side and a demand side, we're really working on the supply side of things, right? Empowering the efficiency, effectiveness of the act of generating a claim about a result that's taking place somewhere, in a forest somewhere or in an agricultural system somewhere. So the biggest friction points definitely are how do you interoperate and integrate many different disparate sources of data in a clean way. And the way that we think about that at Regen Network isn't to create, for instance, another data collection app, but instead to create integrations for the existing tools that farmers or land stewards are already using and allow them to, again, anchor and sign and start to build their data story in a way that can then meet corporate transparency requirements and start to build and automate, eventually start to automate issuance processes where you can clearly set a community can come together, a standards community can come together and say, here's our threshold for counting something as an asset, as a credit, right? And so you can start to automate the understanding of when someone has passed that and sort of strip away, disintermediate that process, make it much more efficient. I think that's where we're hoping to go.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and those are some really interesting challenges and ones that are also near and dear to the work we do at DClimate. And so, on that note, Mark, we work a lot with IPFS and Filecoin Green as a whole, and we've been following your initiatives. What are the challenges you run into when trying to kind of work on scaling the quantity of that decentralized infrastructure? And how do you convince a potential customer that's using kind of standard AWS, Google Cloud offerings to work with something new?
Yeah, those are great and loaded questions. When it comes to, you mentioned IPFS, I failed to mention that earlier in the intro. So Protocol Labs builds solutions as well as internet-level protocols for the next generation of the internet. That's our little business tagline, if you will. IPFS is the Interplanetary File System. This is a way in which you content address data. Content addressing is a core primitive that is basically the alternative to location-based addressing. Location-based addressing being the way that the modern web works. Content addressing is when you cryptographically hash data and therefore establish a content ID associated with that data so that as the data changes state over time, you can establish these end-to-end audit trails of the state changes made to data. And that enables a lot of the things that Gregory was just touching on. So to your question about scaling the network itself, I forget the exact number, but I think there's something like 12,000 independent nodes of IPFS scattered around the world in something like 115 countries. And then on top of that is the Filecoin network, where you can orchestrate storage deals with all of these 3,500 storage providers that I mentioned earlier. These are data centers running IPFS nodes, storing data on behalf of clients. Some of those notable clients and some of those notable data sets are things like all the public data for New York City, data sets from NASA, data sets from CERN, the black hole imagery data from UC Berkeley is on Filecoin, which is a really, really cool data set, and other things like that. Scaling those operations and enabling more data to come onto the network is a big challenge, and it is specifically challenging because of the distributed nature of our network. We have storage providers in 97 different countries with 97 different types of regulations and even more regulations as it relates to environmental regulations all around the world. So trying to create the right environment for these new independent storage providers to come into the network and create, have those offerings to store the massive amounts of data that is trying to be pushed on a network is an ever-growing challenge. Where we differentiate ourselves from AWS and Google and things like that, one is that core primitive of content addressing, but also two, because of the distributed nature of the network, we are a fraction of the cost of AWS or Google or anything like that. That's why big scientific data sets, like from NASA, like from all these academic institutions, like from CERN and others, choose us as their preferred option for archival of large data sets. Because if they did it on AWS or Google or anything else, it would take their entire budget just to store their data. But with us, because of the distributed nature and because it's content addressed data, they can do it for a fraction of that cost.
Got it. Thank you. And
Can I add on to?
yes,
So,
please.
So I think it's really interesting because I think where we start is basically where you leave off, right? And one of the things, everybody's talking about generative AI right now. It's kind of the big hot topic. And so what we're doing, I think, based off of what you all are doing, is like we actually announced a partnership with NASA, for example. We're building geospatial foundation models and just released the first open source one. You're absolutely right. There's definitely a need for what you all are doing. But what we're trying to do is also then push like the application of that, right? So once you have that data, once you have it on the right place, in the right infrastructure, how do you actually leverage AI? Yes, like the ChatGPT type of AI, like large language models, but also with geospatial and images and other ways that we can do more with that to operationalize and action it within the business. And so as we think about like extreme weather and all the things that are going on real time in our world right now, how do we help businesses and customers and consumers and communities to better understand how to take that data and do something with it proactively or reactively, unfortunately. And I think that that's really powerful. So it's really interesting to hear what you're doing kind of on the front end of that to make sure that it's more robust of an infrastructure to allow for it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you're 100% correct. Where we leave off in being a perfect solution for large data sets to act as a place for archival of data is exactly where you guys can, pick that up and provide the solutions, provide the infrastructure for fast retrievals of that archived data to be usable in some of these more enhanced solutions.
Applications.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that's some excellent commentary there. Actually, for you, Christina, and for you, Simone, I'm wondering, as you work with enterprise clients at various sizes, how do you basically get them to value the act of cleaning up their data and making it easier to work with so that you can make these applications? And do you see any market trends around making more sustainable choices when it comes to their carbon footprint of their data centers and things like that?
I can start, yeah. So yes and yes. There's I should say from the very beginning, I don't even think we need to convince anybody that there needs to be cleaning up of data. I think that's like everybody knows that it's a mess right now. It's like when you think about your sustainability or ESG posture from an enterprise perspective, the data is literally in like hundreds of different systems and silos and sources. And if anything, it's just more, how do I get the data that I need and how do I make sense of it in one place rather than, hey, do I even need to clean this up? I think that's kind of a given. From there, though, it is a massive challenge. I mentioned the whole spreadsheet thing before. We work with one customer who's a large property group in Asia Pacific, and they were kind of joking, but not, that they had the world's largest pivot table in Excel, right? It was just like they were trying to manage 35,000 suppliers and everything that they were doing, and you don't want to work on that spreadsheet, right? So that type of thing, that's what companies are doing right now. Again, it's yes, they understand already we need to standardize and clean and all of that, but it's really how do we have some sort of technology platform that helps us to achieve it? And we bought a company last year called Invisi that helps with that. But that's essentially where the tip of the spear is. Now, I mentioned before kind of the operational pieces. You mentioned data centers, for example. Like data centers are a really easy way, if you will, to think about how to get the data and feed it into one place and make sure we're thinking about efficiencies and whatnot. That is one of the products that we have as well, is focus on that element. But I think the biggest piece is the integration, right, between the operations and the core of the business and how that's fed back in an easy way so that it's not manually done by folks. And you don't necessarily need data scientists for it, but you do need purposeful and intentional and deliberate efforts to make sure that integration happens so that you can do something with it and understand that data. It's still a mess though. Like utility companies here in the US, right? Like depending on where you all are from, you probably know some of them you're still getting like almost paper bills. Imagine trying to make sense of that with everything else that's going on, your ERP and financial systems, right? So there are lots of increasing technology and AI applications that we have and others have that help to pull all that together so that isn't a manual effort going forward, because the standardization is just, it's non-existent. And that's like so early stages of where we need to go to get traction, to get to where we all need to get to within the next 3 to 5 years in this world. And so it's more about scale and pace rather than the question of what,
Yeah, I'll just add on top of that. There's some existence of standardization, but it's really
I just meant in terms of the data, the data itself.
Yeah, totally. So our strength is primarily within the public markets. So we collect data, we score, and we provide insights across about 12,000 different publicly listed companies. And where we've started moving really over the past year is into the private markets. And that's where it is really a mess today. So we have just launched a partnership with the Integrated Disclosure Project. I don't know if any of you is familiar, yeah. And these are some large names, right? KKR, Apollo, Blackstone. They're really the founding committee. And the aim is data convergence. So how can we leverage platforms like MSCI's, where we already have the infrastructure built up? We've been collecting data for 30 plus years on private companies. And how do you do it in an anonymized way? What's the incentive for private companies to want to input their data? They're already being asked across numerous stakeholders for different sets of data. And so how do you harmonize that? And then once you gather that data, then how are you reporting that back to the GPs or those that are really approved? And so we haven't even launched this. This is October. We'll probably go live, but our attempts are being made, and I think it's these types of projects that will help incentivize the private companies and help them with automation and scale around data collection.
Got it. Thank you. And to kind of build off that, Mark, I wanted to ask you, what role do you see open source networks and open source software in indexing a lot of this publicly available data? Making some of these unstructured data sets more easy to work with for the broader public.
Yeah, another great question. I think there's a huge potential, a huge role that it can play, that open source networks, open source technology, and distributed networks such as Filecoin and IPFS can play in this. Both of you, maybe I'll pull on a thread something both of you were talking about. Once you have all that data, making sense of it is very difficult. And as I mentioned with content addressing, over time, as that data changes, being able to establish kind of audit trails of the changes to that data is something that I think is very important. And with content addressing and with IPFS, you can, the aspects of content addressing allow for you to enhance the transparency and the verifiability of these data points, allowing you to make sense of all of these independent data points as you're collecting them. Going back to some conversations we had last week, though, even before all of that, there's still, in the context of sustainability and environmental reporting, there's still a huge problem or challenge that we all face, which is getting that data. There are so many data gaps that exist with regard to corporate sustainability reporting, with regard to inventory analysis of emissions for nation states or for sectors or for industries. All of that is a huge issue that we need to address, and I think that open source technologies, distributed systems could help in a myriad of ways. I mean, going back to the DMRV panel that we just talked about, being able to ingest all that data from a number of solutions and having it housed in these distributed networks and then being integrated into other solutions built on top of it to make sense of all of the independent data points.
Can I add to that? One thing that we're seeing with the banks that is emerging, I would phrase it as a use case, but not in the traditional sense of how they're actually integrating the data and then building into their workflows for signals. It's model validation. So, and that's something that is really the past 6 months we've been asked this more and more from some of the larger banks, and it's tied to some regulation and stress tests on their own book of business. But it's essentially asking us how to provide documentation that we have a lot of, but resources, personnel, and something that we've built over the years. But a lot of these model validation teams, they've been in existence for a long time, but across financial metrics. And now they're either remaining in their roles and then just learning about climate and how they should validate those metrics, or pulling in some climate scientists and then having to collaborate and rally around the particular asks, like how to prove climate change. So it's something that despite the large scale that we have and all the infrastructure at MSCI, it's still a challenge because there's new data points that the modeling teams are being asked as they validate.
Got it. Thank you. Greg, I wanted to turn it back to you. Obviously, big data architecture, much like any other kind of facet of tech, evolves very quickly. And so you mentioned zero knowledge proofs earlier and how you work with CK. I wanted to get your kind of take on what it's like working with the bleeding edge of technology in this area, and how applicable is it, and how much time do you spend kind of wrangling to make it work?
It's a great question. I mean, I think actually we're just in the middle right now of, it's kind of an existential question, right? How much time do you spend at the bleeding edge of innovation, getting the architecture right for the system that needs to happen, versus how much time do you spend on the user-driven experience that is more that is much easier to build with tools that are going to be accruing tech debt as you go forward. It's a really hard question to answer as a startup or even as a existing business. I think it's kind of the perennial tech question. So how we think about that at the moment is we actually feel that the industry and we ourselves, Regen Ledger, the data module, the tools that have been built, the APIs that have been built, have actually crossed a maturity threshold at this stage. And at this moment, we're really kind of refocusing on the usability story and just anchoring the cycles so that it becomes easier and easier. And I think just to really focus on one of the big user experience challenges of distributed systems, it's really, sovereign data, sovereign identity, and the hurdles that throws in what users expect for how to log in, for instance. It's hard, all of a sudden you're asking people to manage keys, and there's issues with that. And luckily, there's a lot of work that's happening in our ecosystem and beyond around how to solve some of those issues. But what we are seeing is that there's a real opportunity to, in this moment, to kind of take our feet off the gas of really, we're going to stridently and always be picking the absolute purest and best decentralized data story, and ask a little bit more, how do we, given that this kind of, my proposition is, actually exists in a good enough state now, and the question becomes, how do we start incrementally inviting users into engaging with it, to start building out the data graph, to start improving the insights, and start delivering the value? Because we've kind of, I would propose, especially with where artificial intelligence and machine learning, large language models have gotten to over the last year or so, that we've actually crossed a threshold of good enoughness with the decentralized architecture, and it's time to go back out of the sort of purity of the research and into the just really practical, functional, how do we make this accessible and applicable to these constituencies that we need to be bringing into the system?
I'll just add one point. I think that's spot on, because I do think that, you go back to your original question around the expectation of data and what they need. I do think that there's a little bit of like the purity that you mentioned, this, I can't do anything until I have 100% of control. And it's like just 80-20, like the majority of problems you'll be able to fix with that 80% of insights and knowledge, just get to that faster. And the remainder 20%, you'll get there, right, as you're kind of going along the journey. But I do think that there's a little bit of analysis by paralysis by analysis happening. And I think that that's exactly right. And we're seeing a lot of that too. Yeah.
Especially when you put it in the context of sustainability and corporate sustainability reporting. We all know that with the regards to the science, it's incredibly clear we need to speed up our actions. We need to scale it tremendously. And with regard to decentralized applications, with regard to all this stuff in the Web3 space, I think that far too often we are sacrificing the good for the perfect, and we're not meeting the customers where they're at. And we need to, recognize we can create the most incredible technical solution, but if nobody's using it, it's not providing any value. So
I would just to add, we recently did analysis on biodiversity labeled funds. And let's put greenwashing aside for the moment, but thinking about, so is biodiversity in the name of the fund and also the prospectus? And what we found is that there are some flows into biodiversity labeled funds, and there are even more flows into biodiversity related funds where they're pulling from thematics or engagement strategies, agriculture, ecology, weather, ocean, et cetera. So it was interesting to see that in the fund naming conventions, and then also their investment thesis. It has to go beyond what is nearly existent, which is biodiversity today, despite us talking about it across Climate Week.
You mind if I share a quick, just like
Please.
on the ground application story? So this is all pretty abstract. We're talking about data, infrastructure, architecture, insights. How do we generate intelligence around things? I think we also have to acknowledge that this relates very deeply to market instruments, market signals, policy decisions. How does this actually get applied? And I think there's a lot of wrangling and confusion right now. For instance, like, is a carbon credit a carbon credit?
Maybe.
Maybe not. And in what conditions and in what situations is a claim that's being made something that has additive value to the world and the stakeholders? The same is certainly true of biodiversity. How are we going to define it? What does it mean? And I think what we've been finding is, what's interesting is the data is good enough and the tools are good enough to start deploying capital to things we know are going to have positive impact, but we're a little, this is like 80-20, but we're a little unsure exactly, the rigor and precision of our understanding is still shy. Okay, so the opportunity to innovate new, this is, at Regen Network, we're really excited about the opportunity to innovate with new stewardship credits that have real-time data backing them and offer a buyer a right of first refusal or even an offtake agreement for if and when the results match the standards that are emerging. And what's interesting about that as an opportunity is it can align a whole set of stakeholders with the understanding that we need to be enhancing the data together, the methodologies together, the standards together. Because right now what we're seeing in the space is a lot of kind of meaningless standard ego fighting, where people are, like, let's face it, VC backed oftentimes startups are saying we have the best, algorithm for monitoring, reporting, and verification for variable X, and then somebody else is saying the same thing. Oftentimes, they're both claiming to have done it first, which, by the way, the European Space Agency and NASA had many of these indicators published and available for all of us to be using like 15 years ago. So the next time I see somebody say that they have the first one, you might see me pulling my hair out in the back. The point that I'm trying to make, though, is we have to separate competitive advantage in the marketplace for your ability to market that you have the unified information solution, and understand that we should have competitive advantage in the marketplace based on your ability to collect great data, share it with the most people, and prove that you have impacts happening in a place on Earth. And that's what we should be competing towards. That's the competition we need.
Drop the mic.
Well, it's going to be tough to follow, but
Thanks for letting me rant.
no, it's good. I appreciate it. I'm definitely guilty of doing the same quite often. I wanted to touch on something Mark said earlier, which is sacrificing the good for the perfect. I think about this a lot when it comes to ESG and reporting frameworks. So, Simone, from your vantage point, I'd love to get an idea from you of what you think is a good or good enough reporting framework that would be easy for companies to take on.
I don't think that was in our prep call.
None of this was in our prep call.
None of this. You weren't in our prep call.
That's correct.
Sorry, the question is around which of the reporting frameworks?
Yeah, so when it comes to ESG reporting, you have all these multiple scopes, and when
Can we just get rid of ESG?
I mean, I can't publicly say sure to that, but maybe. So,
Is this a climate panel?
when it comes to ESG reporting, you have all these multiple scopes, and at some point, you're trying to wrangle through a system that's interconnected, right? So, whose emissions count towards what company and things like that. How do you see companies kind of navigating this space into a way to report what their actual environmental footprint is without getting burdened in basically trying to dig through this and burdened in reporting?
Well, I work with a lot of investors. What they'll say is that the reporting frameworks are based on policy and what's being asked in the TCFD and SFDR, and I'm sorry for the acronyms. I was actually reading a UNEP white paper this morning, and there were 3 pages of acronyms, so it's confusing to practitioners even. But that's what we're seeing. Now, the question is that the right North Star? Is that the right compass? I don't know. We've built a lot of tools and templates to help in that effort because we've touched on this idea of making sense of climate data, and without that, there's this fear that they'll be working too much on a particular area that's specific for their industry, specific for their peer group, without actually putting all their resources into something that really matters, which is regulatory and obligatory reporting. So I'd say, fortunately, unfortunately, it's really around what's being asked of them from a regulatory standpoint.
I'll add to that. So when we get the question, which we do a lot from customers, like, how do I get started? We tell them, look, the landscape is evolving real time, right? I mean, you're seeing regulations come out real time across the world that are somewhat overlapping, sometimes not. Different nonprofits are also coming out with their own standards and frameworks. So we say, we know that you have to comply, but while your legal team figures out what you have to comply with and why and by how, by when, we go back to the data question, right? That's like the topic of it. So you still need to understand and get a handle on your data. So understand where you are, understand what data is important to you, and then you can figure out what's material so that whatever the rest of your colleagues or the rest of the organization or the rest of the world figures out is that global standard or framework that we're all hopefully gonna align around, then you're prepared, right? And again, it's like the 80-20 piece, just get to the 80%, because then you'll figure out the details to finalize the remainder 20%. But right now there's like all this flailing happening. Like, do I figure out what I need to do for CSRD? How is that different from what's happening with California or the SEC that might come out or TNFD or, name your alphabet soup framework. It's just get started and figure out where you are and what you need to get towards in order to try to finalize. And I think that's like, that would be my final point on this is like, I think people just need to get started. And a lot of enterprises that we work with, they just don't even know where to start. Yeah.
I also think it's important to acknowledge in the midst of all of this that there is a significant first mover competitive advantage for companies that sort of are aggressive in generating an understanding of how to make material improvements in whatever framework you're measuring from, and that it's never going to be cheaper than it is today to be a climate leader. Yep. And it's going to get more and more expensive. Yep. And there are people who understand that. And those people are both being aggressive in taking action and being aggressive in participating in the conversations about the standard setting. And those are the businesses that will win. Mm-hmm. And so, that's the world that we live in. And I think we should be applauding and egging on the companies that are taking significant leadership, and that's where this is at. That's the sort of positive and exciting side of things.
Oh, one other thought to that, though. I think you're right in that regulatory compliance is what's driving a lot of this action. But to what you're saying, I think when we work with companies where we feel like it's not just from a compliance perspective, but really this is helping me to be a better business that's relevant for the next generation, that those are the companies that are going to really get ahead. So regardless of what happens, regulations and frameworks, they will be prepared because they're thinking beyond that. They have to in order to survive, I think, honestly.
It's really hard, though, right? We don't envy the role of the chief sustainability officer because they are first responding to legal and compliance, and then they have to go to the risk department where the model validators are, and then they go to the investment team and have to prove alpha. And then they have to go to their reporting and IR teams and come up with some, integrated framework and response that they're making publicly, which we've seen quite a big decrease in terms of public commitments. So they're having to have all those conversations and get alignment internally, which is really tough, especially among more of the financial services.
Got it. Thank you. And with that, we're going to conclude this panel. But I really appreciate you guys sharing your insights and sharing your experiences working in the space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.